Thank you. It's nice to be here. I'm intrigued by the tradition of beginning the series by naming all the writers who have been here. I'm intrigued by how that's going to work out in another 10 or 15 years. I assume the presentations will just get shorter and shorter and shorter. You won't actually need to have anybody here by the time you're done. Yeah. But it was fun to hear the names of some old friends in that list. And it was lovely to meet and talk with Ricardo before we came over here. The ideal thing would be if I'd prepared to talk from this new book, A Muse and a Maze, the subtitle of which is in fact Writing as Puzzle, Mystery, and Magic, in which I talk a bit about magic, and it would have been fun for you to do your stuff. I did actually have the good fortune of having a wonderful magician by the name of Joshua Jay, who makes his way around. If you care about magic, you'll see him sometime. But Joshua Jay happened to be coming through Houston to talk about a book he had written about magic for kids. And so I had him come into my graduate creative writing workshop, which was a great idea in that they loved it and he was very interesting. And he's interested in writing too, so we had plenty to talk about. And also a terrible idea, and I assume that it would have been difficult to follow you for the same reason, which is that the entire time we were talking, of course, he was doing various tricks. He was, bending quarters and having things appear in people's pockets. And so it was the only time I've taught a class where students were going, "No way! Get out of here!" They were very enthusiastic about what he was doing. And so then I just had to talk about writing after that, which was not as exciting. So these last two books that I've done, A Muse and a Maze is the most recent one, and then over here, Maps of the Imagination, are books about writing, but they both approach very specific aspects. I talk primarily about fiction writing, although also about poetry and screenwriting, and I think most of the ideas apply to almost all kinds of creative writing anyway. But approach the discussion of writing through metaphor in both cases. As Ricardo was just saying, in A Muse and a Maze, I was kind of struggling to find the metaphor that held it all together. What I was interested in was the notion that essentially all kinds of writing involve or depend on the strategic release of information. And that's as true for a love letter and a business memo as it is for a story or a poem. If you do it well, you're thinking about your audience, you're thinking about what you want to convey, you're thinking about how you want to convey it, and you're anticipating the response that you might get. All of that is kind of strategic thinking in a way, although some people don't like to think about love letters strategic. There you go. I mean, it is on some level. And so A Muse and a Maze it kind of interrogates the idea about to what extent every act of writing is a conscious act, and to what extent being conscious of how we're doing things helps the work, and at the same time acknowledging that part of the work we do, particularly in poetry and fiction and screenplays and even personal essays, transcends the rational. I mean, if you've written yourself, you write a particularly good line or a scene or a couple of lines in a poem, and you think, where did that come from? I mean, that's what I want to do all the time, but that's not what I do all the time. And so there's something transcendent that comes from the practice. We were talking about the fact that that can even happen in math. You can be working on a thorny problem, and things will kind of fall out in a very neat or elegant way. And if you appreciate math and science, there's kind of a beauty to that. Although people who don't find it odd to talk about the beauty of a differential equation. But sometimes it feels that way, that the numbers align in a way that's particularly pleasing. Anyway, so in Maps of the Imagination, I talk about writing and cartography. I was inspired by some reading I'd done at the time. Apparently, although I hadn't really realized that, I've been interested in maps all my life. I hadn't realized it until some interviewer pointed out that I refer to maps a lot. But I was interested in the metaphor, and I wrote an essay called The Writer as Cartographer, and then a woman who's the editor now at Trinity University Press in San Antonio asked me if I was interested in developing it into a book, and I said absolutely not. That I said what I had to say about it. And then I thought about it for a while, and I realized, and people kept sending me maps stuff, and my interest is not primarily in maps, and I don't really know a lot about, I was going to say know anything, but that's not true. Know a lot about maps. My interest is in writing, and secondarily in how it's like cartography. And the more I thought about it, the more there were things I hadn't fully explored, so I thought I would see how much more there was, and sure enough, there turned out to be this book. So this book has odd chapter titles, and I'm going to tell you what those are, and I'm going to read 3 paragraphs, and then I'm going to show you some things. The chapter titles are Metaphor or the Map. You can probably hear the anagram in that, metaphor or the map. I was quite pleased with that. But it's an introduction to the metaphor. A wide landscape of snows is a line from Moby Dick. And he's actually, Melville's actually describing the ocean as a wide landscape of snows. And he's talking about the blankness of the ocean, the difficulty in navigating the ocean because there's no obvious signs of where to go on the ocean. And that chapter is about omission. It's about leaving things blank. In the history of cartography, there was an important moment when the French most notably decided that maps should be scientific. This was not always the way, and that the only things that should be on a map are the things that you can prove belong on the map. So no sea serpents, no dragons, no whimsical creatures, none of that. But these should be scientific documents. And that's what we talk about when we talk about weather maps or road maps. Although the maps people like to collect often are decorative and beautiful and not necessarily, we'll say true, although that's a complicated term. But Dennis Wood, who teaches critical cartography in North Carolina, says that a map is defined by everything that's left off of it, which is an interesting notion because we have everything. You don't need a map with everything on it. In fact, if you have a map with everything on it, you probably can't use it. Right? I mean, if it has every storm drain, every post office box, every light post, you'll never be able to find the streets you're looking for. And so omission is an important part of map making, but also poetry and fiction, thinking about how you want to steer the reader's attention. Projections and conventions is about map making, but it's also about the projections and conventions used in stories and poetry, the conventions that we're aware of, and also the ones that we take on because they're part of the literary tradition behind us, and the extent to which we make use of them, or as writers we need to be aware of them. Imaginary Scrolls continues that, and I'll show you the image that inspired that title. But it's about defying convention and how that's useful. Theater of the World is the translation of the title of the first atlas. The notion was that you could put all the world on paper as if it were a stage. You've probably heard Shakespeare kind of echo somewhere in that line. But it's interesting that Theater of the World, the title of the atlas, is itself a metaphor. And of course, the maps themselves are a metaphor for the world as we know it. And that chapter is about the desire to include everything, to collect everything, to get everything into a story, to be complete in some way, which is an impulse we've kind of inherited for a long time. And of course, when Google tries to scan every book or Wikipedia tries to have an article on everything imaginable, I mean, these are more ideas along those lines, like the Library at Alexandria, to try to collect everything, to try to have it all together. Then a rigorous geometry is partly about math, which scares some writers, but it's about the underpinning of math in maps, but it's also about this rational act of writing that I was talking about, and particularly about writers like, I don't know, the founders of the Oulipo movement in France and Italy, who were interested in creating new forms for writing, a very kind of heady, kind of an academic approach to writing, although they also had a lot of fun. They were jokesters, a lot of them. And I'm interested in that impulse behind writing, and then the realistic impulse, which most of the writers I know follow, and how they speak to one another. And then Ploughshares is about the fact that in the history of discovery and exploration, people have often been inclined to say, I've found everything, I've seen everything, including Galileo, who looked up at the skies and said, you know, it's been left to me to find everything. And you know, he was kind of an arrogant fellow, but did a lot of good work. And then, of course, we've discovered quite a lot since then. But often people say this is the end, and that chapter was inspired by an essay I read by a fellow named Arthur Crystal, who was one of the many people to say, you know, the novel was dead, and there was no point in going on. Poetry is dead is another argument that's made about every half hour, and people respond to that in different ways. But it's interesting, this notion to think we're at the end necessarily, and then of course Ploughshares is the notion that we go on, we go further, because the maps that said Ni Ploughshares were saying this is at the end of the world. Essentially, you can't go beyond this point. So here are the first 3, or 2 maybe, paragraphs of this book. The writer is an explorer is the epigraph. Every step is an advance into new land. That's Emerson. Their earliest extant alphabetic texts, the earliest extant geographical maps, and the earliest extant map of the human brain date back to the same general period, around 3000 BC. While no one can say for certain when the first writing and mapping occurred, the reasons for recording who we are, where we are, what is, and what might be haven't changed much over time. The earliest maps are thought to have been created to help people find their way and to reduce their fear of the unknown. We want to know the location of what we deem life-sustaining, hunting grounds, sources of fresh water. Now utility lines and grocery stores, and life-threatening, on other people's lands, the toxic runoff from a landfill. Now, as then, we record great conflicts and meaningful discoveries. We organize information on maps in order to see our knowledge in a new way. As a result, maps suggest explanations, and while explanations reassure us, they also inspire us to ask more questions, consider other possibilities. To ask for a map is to say, tell me a story. Writing is often discussed as two separate acts, though in practice they overlap, intermingle, and impersonate each other. They differ in emphasis, but are by no means merely sequential. If we do them well, both result in discovery. One is the act of exploration, some combination of premeditated searching and undisciplined, perhaps only partly conscious rambling. This involves scribbling notes, considering potential scenes, lines, or images, inventing characters, even writing drafts. History tells us exploration is assertive action in the face of uncertain assumptions, often involving false starts, missteps, and surprises, all familiar parts of the writer's work. If we persist, we discover our story or poem or novel within the world of that story. The other act of writing we might call presentation. Applying knowledge, skill, and talent, we create a document meant to communicate with and have an effect on others. The purpose of a story or poem, unlike that of a diary, is not to record our experience, but to create a context for and to lead the reader on a journey. That is to say, at some point, we turn from the role of explorer to take on that of guide. I hadn't really thought about it until just now, but actually that applies to magic as well. There's a great book by Jim Steinmeier called Hiding the Elephant, which is really, this makes it sound dull, but it's quite a good book, about the history of the use of mirrors in magic. But he starts with the anecdote about Houdini making an elephant disappear on stage. The people who got to see that, which he didn't do many times, included Orson Welles, who was a young boy when he saw the performance, and he said later it was terrible stuff. And Houdini dropped it from his act because nobody was impressed. All right, this is a live elephant on stage in a theater which seems to disappear, and nobody cared. He knew how to do it, but he had no talent for that kind of magic. I mean, Houdini was not a very good magician. We know Houdini because he was a fantastic escape artist. And I actually talk about that in A Muse and a Maze. There are some kinds of writers who write outward and others who draw on their own experience. Houdini had to be the focus of attention. And when he was the focus of attention, he could shine. He was pretty remarkable. But when he was dealing with like rabbits and cards and elephants, not much interest, and he wasn't terribly effective at it. So this act of presentation is an important one. It's not merely tidying things up, but it's really being the storyteller in the case of fiction. Finally, artistic creation is a voyage into the unknown, our topic for today. In our own eyes, we are off the map. The excitement of potential discovery is accompanied by anxiety, despair, caution perhaps boldness, and always the risk of failure. Failure can take the form of our becoming hopelessly lost or pointlessly lost or not finding what we came for, though that last is sometimes happily accompanied by the discovery of something we didn't anticipate, couldn't even imagine before we found it. We strike out for what we believe to be uncharted waters, only to find ourselves sailing in someone else's bathtub. Those are the days it seems there is nothing new to discover but the limitations of our own experience and understanding. Well, you know the feeling, I suppose. And I actually like what Ricardo said too about kind of daring to stand up and give an introduction to I guess this is a humanities talk or a writing talk or something, but going out of your discipline, something that I enjoy doing all the time. I end up working with artists and game designers and other people and cartographers, even though those are not my fields, and there's always a sense of danger and vulnerability about that. And you have to be willing to I have to be willing to make a fool of myself by asking all kinds of obvious questions. But it's often not only educational, but sort of exciting to try to make connections between what I know about and care about and what other people are so deeply invested in. I got to give a talk to not software designers, it's OOPS, the Object-Oriented Programming Software and Language I don't know what the last word is. But it was up in Montreal, an international group of really language creators, computer language creators. And the fellow who had introduced me had me come upstairs to see the presentations that they were giving as part of the conference the night before I was supposed to talk. And all of it was in English, and I could not understand a word. It was a phenomenal feeling to look at all these words, know that the letters and individual words were familiar, and I had no idea what they were talking about. It is fascinating. All right, so here's the irony about this act of discovery. While I hate to be lost in life geographically, as a writer, I deliberately enter terra incognita, unknown territory. Of course, I'm not alone in this. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The writer is an explorer. Every step is an advance into new land." Graham Greene wrote, "If this book of mine fails to take a straight course, it's because I'm lost in a strange region. I have no map." Octavio Paz wrote, "Tomorrow we shall have to invent once more the reality of this world." When we're writing, or at least in early drafts, we get depressed when we can see exactly where we are and where we're going. Our job is to discover something, and no one else can tell us how to get there. We don't even know exactly what we're looking for. Not only can we not ask for directions, but there's no map to where we're headed, because the only reason we're writing is that no map we know of exists to take a reader to precisely that place, wherever it is. When it comes to artistic endeavors, to refuse to allow yourself to get lost is a failure of imagination. So let's see. So those are books. You kind of recognize those. In my home, I put them on shelves. I stack them on the floor, and there are piles everywhere. Anyway, those are books. And this is a book, but this is what Brian Detmer, an artist, I think he still lives in Chicago, does with books. I don't know that he dislikes books, but he turns them into sculpture, and he does it entirely with scalpels. And he cuts through the books to reveal an image or a combination of words and images. Quite fascinating work, but a completely different way to see the object. I hope he likes to read too. I haven't talked to him. Saul Bellow says, "Perhaps being lost, one should get loster." And that's what I hope to encourage today. I want to give you an example. I knew there'd be some undergraduates here, and I thought I'd tell you briefly about the products of some of the students at U of H, and of course I did with Cheryl Beckett in design a year or two ago. It was called Creative Mapping, and we got students together and we had them think about mapping in different ways, the designers and writers collaborating on different kinds of projects. And the final project of the semester, the one we had a little money for to be able to produce, the notion was that it would be a partial atlas of Houston. And the challenge was to ask the students of things that they would be interested in seeing mapped, that they were pretty confident no one had mapped before, and that couldn't be mapped simply by tweaking Google Maps, by going to Google Maps and looking for a particular thing and then printing it out. And so they came up with all kinds of ideas. I don't know what you would try to map, in Victoria, but in Houston, the most popular topic, I think 6 different people had listed it, was potholes. And so the challenge was, of course, potholes move, they change. Any map only lasts for a short period of time, is only accurate for a short period of time. So the challenge was not to map individual potholes so much, but to figure out how to map them in some interesting or compelling way. And so this map is called Holy City. H-O-L with the E in parentheses, Y, Holy City. And they decided to map, of all the pairings they came up with, and they were pretty interesting, to map potholes and megachurches. And they were particularly interested in the fact that the city was always saying that they didn't have enough money to fill all the potholes, but of course the megachurches are tax exempt. Right, and so I said, well, if they were taxed, by their revenue, or as far as we can tell, would that take care of our pothole problem? And indeed, it would more than take care of our pothole problem. The design is kind of clever there, and we've got the little hole that lets you see the title. And then they actually went around one of the mega churches in Houston, and they mapped all the potholes right around it on the roads directly adjacent to the church to try to demonstrate the extent of the problem. And here they're indicated by different sizes. And then the brilliant part of the prose is that they combine, I don't want to name names, I guess. Oh, okay, it's Liquid. But the writer combined statements about Liquid, a statement from the city's pamphlets on potholes and pothole repair, and the Bible. And Joel's sermons. And mix them in here. And the challenge is to tell which is from which source. And you'd be surprised. This map is called triskaidekaphobia, a word that I didn't know until they had made this map. Triskaidekaphobia is the fear of the number 13. But the brilliant thing about this map, which actually won a design award in town, this is just the kind of back of the map and the prose bit of it. And then this is the map. Some students realized, one of them had been down to a building in the medical center and was taken by the fact that there is no floor number 13 in a hospital. All right, this is a superstition at work in a hospital. So they decided to go around to the whole area downtown and to see how many of the medical buildings didn't have floors numbered 13. It turned out most of them. And so they mapped the buildings that don't have a floor numbered 13 and talked about the fear of 13s in that, and the extent to which that jives with a belief in medicine. It's an interesting place for that to come up. Let's see, maybe one more. Ghost spikes in here, graveyards. Signals to noise is kind of fun, because this is a thing you would not necessarily think about mapping. What they did is they went around a few neighborhoods, Montrose, the Galleria, maybe the Heights. They went around 3 neighborhoods with their phones turned on, searching for Wi-Fi networks. And they mapped the different Wi-Fi networks they walked through. Not that were all publicly available, but they mapped them, and what they were interested in was the way people name their Wi-Fi networks. And so some of them, of course, are pretty generic, home 2197.2.4, I mean, who cares? But then there are things like ham guest cheddar, I pay for electric, yeah, king of tobacco. A few vulgar ones, which I won't read. Yeah, go Cougs. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah. NSA narcotics, FBI surveillance, that kind of stuff. Yo mama's house. And anyway, and then they made an index by political, provocative, referential puns, and the obvious. And they mapped the Wi-Fi networks in those areas. So the whole point of the exercise was to think about different ways to see the city, because the first exercise for the semester, which I've done with other classes, was to simply ask them to map the campus. I said, all right, you've been here. Most of those students were seniors, juniors, and seniors. And I said, well, you've been here for a while. Go ahead and sketch us a little map of the U of H campus, just right here, not the satellite campuses, nothing else. And first of all, there was a lot of blank. I mean, there were a lot of buildings. They had no idea what they were called or what they were for or why they existed, as far as I could tell. They all knew the architecture building, because all the design students worked in the architecture building. They all knew the architecture building. They knew where at least one parking lot was, and they knew where the food trucks were. Very interesting. But where the science buildings were, not a clue. No idea. And so it was really interesting to think about how they saw space, how they saw a place, and we all do it. And that's one example of getting lost, of saying, all right, if I'm going to bring a completely different perspective to this, how do I see? And in fiction or poetry, and again, remember, I'm really only interested in this as metaphor. In fiction or poetry, the challenge is always try to see through someone else's eyes, to say, how does this character, how would this person see the world? How would this person understand the thing that is so familiar to me? Or how do I grapple with this thing that's so foreign to me? And that's one of the challenges always in writing, is to try to fully inhabit what we imagine is someone else's perspective. To some extent, you can do that through research. To some extent, you have to do it through close observation. And that's what we were trying to encourage in those maps. So I'll show you a few others, and we'll see how this goes. I've got to be aware of my time. Okay, I'll show you a few. Perhaps you know the story of Henry Beck. Henry Beck was an engineer in London. The London tube map was a disaster, which is to say it was perfectly accurate. It showed all the lines and all the stops, and it showed where the lines curved and where they went, and it had every stop name, and it was unreadable. Often people would miss their trains trying to read the map. This was a problem, and they had a contest. The London Tube sponsored a contest to develop a useful map for the tube. Henry Beck was not a part of that. He was an engineer, but he knew the world, of course, of wiring diagrams, right, and schematics. And so he decided that would be a useful way to translate the map of the tube. And this is not the map of the London Underground. This is the map of the DC Metro, but the kind of mapping that he invented, essentially, or applied for the first time to mass transit is so popular that virtually every urban rail system uses something like it now. And you, I'm sure, are familiar with that kind of image, if not that one in particular. But the things to note about it are that it is inaccurate in the sense that it doesn't actually show us how far apart the stations are. Right? If you're working underground trying to repair these lines, this is a horrible map. right? Because you have no idea how far you have to walk to get to the next station. Also, all of the angles and turns of the line are reduced to a few choices, right? 90 degrees, 45 degrees on some of these maps, 30 and 60 degrees. But they don't tend to realistically capture the curves of the lines. Again, the point of this map is to tell people what line they need to be on to get where, and how many stops they have to wait for to get to the stop they want to get to. And so by deliberately removing a whole lot of accurate information and by distorting information in a particularly useful way, Henry Beck made a map that has been used now for over 100 years all over the world. And so sometimes the conventions that we have in mind, the things that seem right, are wrong for the application, are wrong for the thing we're trying to achieve. And it took, a non-map maker to think of this and to have some great success with it. William Herschel, the amateur astronomer who discovered Uranus, said this: seeing is an art which must be learnt. The learnt makes it feel a little archaic, but I think it's still true today. The wonderful story about Herschel is that he taught himself astronomy by getting a telescope and then looking at and trying to identify everything that everybody else had identified before him. Good practice, good thing to keep in mind while you're doing some tedious memorization in some introductory class. So he wanted to get all of that down, then to be able to see what nobody else had discovered. And part of that, at the time, lenses had copper wires running through them for the integrity of the lens, and it meant that that would turn green over time, of course, and it would obscure the view. And so during the day, astronomers typically polish their lenses. And so he would polish his lenses, and his sister read to him from 1001 Nights while he polished his lenses. I don't know why, I love that detail. But Herschel said, seeing is an art which must be learned. And that's something as writers, certainly as mathematicians, as urban planners, as inventors, I mean, you have to remind yourself all the time to kind of unsee things or to break yourself away from the familiar way of seeing so that you can see something new. That's true of problem solving. It's also true of going to new places and having new experiences. So here's a map which was in honor of the presidential campaign, I suppose, a bit of political propaganda when there was a debate about the gold standard and the silver standard. A meatpacking firm actually paid for this map. They were a little irritated, apparently, and they wanted to show that the gold standard was the favorite of the Northeast, whereas most of the country was for the silver standard. And so we have the classic tail wagging the dog. And even if you don't study the prose, I might have taken off on a Knuckles Packing Company, right? Meat packers supporting this. Even if you don't study the prose or the numbers, the visual makes the argument pretty quickly. What's this? Oh, this is a map that I got in Australia. I'm disappointed that they call it the upside down world map because, of course, there is no up in space, right? I mean, to put north of to orient maps toward the north is completely a convention, and it was not the convention for a long time when a lot of maps were oriented to the east. And in fact, it still disturbs me that Google Maps, if you are walking somewhere particularly, it's disorienting because it doesn't necessarily lead you north. It just kind of gives you the map and you find your way around the particular objects or streets you're walking around. But here, it's interesting to see how disorienting this map is. I mean, there's little us, the United States over there. There's great big Canada. There's a mess of Canada. And then Australia, of course, is pretty nearly the center because that's what we do, right? We put ourselves at the center of maps. And when the mayor of Venice, I believe, saw Fra Mauro's world map, he said, "Why is the rest of the world so large and Venice so small?" But we all tend to think that way. Of course, we know the area where we've been.
What's the red line in the middle?
That has got to be. Is that the date line? I can't read it. There, I should know.
Is that weird there?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't.
Yes. Yeah. No, it does in the ocean. Yeah. Where it doesn't do any harm. Yeah. So they call it the upside down world map, but again, there's no reason for it to be called upside down. It's an orientation that favors Australia, but why not if you're in Australia? What I'm interested in is if this were the map that was hanging in front of elementary school classrooms throughout the United States, I wonder if we wouldn't think of ourselves a little bit differently. I wonder if that wouldn't affect the way we think about our place in the world, not for better or for worse necessarily. Typically, when war breaks out, there's a huge interest in maps of the place we don't know. After 9/11, there were more maps of Afghanistan in the New York Times than we'd ever seen before, so that everybody could kind of learn where things were and where things were coming from. Before that, in World War II, there were maps centered on the North Pole because we saw how close we were to Russia, among other places, but how planes changed our sense of geography and what we were close to. All right, so this is what gave me the title Imaginary Scrolls. This is a page which has been colored, the original's in black and white, but a page from John Ogilvy's Britannia, which was the first national road atlas. John Ogilvy was an interesting guy. He was a dancer. He got injured, as dancers will eventually, then he became a dance instructor. I guess that didn't work out over time. He became an insurance adjuster in London. And then he kind of fell into cartography pretty late in life. He was an older man when he started this. And you have to imagine, you have to remember there was a time when permanent features of the landscape were things like boulders or waterfalls, right, which we now think of as maybe a little more temporary, unfortunately. Roads were not permanent features of the landscape, and dirt paths, which is mostly what they're talking about, but those were features which people had kind of created as the easiest way to get from one place to another, but they weren't necessarily the thing you focused on in a landscape. But there became a need, it was clear, for a series of maps of the roads in England. And Ogilvy needed to think of a way to present them that would make it particularly easy to use. And he came up with a great idea, which is, he says in the introduction to the book, to imagine you're holding a scroll, and you can see that the artist kind of helped us by kind of drawing in images of a scroll at the top and the bottom. And you follow it from top to bottom. This happens to be the map from London to Oxford. There's Oxford up top, London's down here. And you follow it on this trip. If, I don't know if you are old enough, I suppose, to have used triptychs by AAA, which I am, you see that they use it. And apparently you can still get those. You can order from AAA triptychs, which work the same way. They're strip maps. And so you follow from the bottom to the top of one strip, and then the next, and the next, as if it were one continuing stroll until you get to Oxford. The interesting thing about this is he ignored the fact that the compass orientation changes. You can see the compass rose in these maps. It's fairly straight, but it's pointing at like 3 o'clock there and then up to 2. So he wasn't interested in the orientation of the streets. He was interested in market towns, in ferries, in how you crossed rivers, all of that sort of information. And so he needed a way to present the roads that made sense to someone using the roads, not to someone who was interested in capturing the landscape as a whole correctly. The mistake he made was that this is a giant atlas. I mean, you can't carry it with you. It's probably, I don't know, 15 inches high and 11 or 12 inches wide. And so someone immediately pirated it, printed a version you could put in your pocket, and made a lot of money. So maybe that explains, some of his other problems. This is a map. Some people want to insist it's a chart, whatever you want to call it. It's an attempt to illustrate the world's longest rivers and highest mountains. If you're going hiking, this is not a good map. Not terribly helpful, but again, it's a way to think about the presentation of something that people want to know, but isn't easily accessible on what we think of as a typical map. And then there's, of course, one you're familiar with, the map of Atlantic City, which was distorted for a particular purpose and has been hugely successful for its purpose. Although, again, if you're interested in going to Atlantic City, even at the time when it was made, it wouldn't be terribly helpful to you. I'm going to try to squeeze this in. I know a few people have to leave, and it's okay if you do. But this is, well, what is this a map of? Yeah, how do you know? Yeah, have any of you stood back and seen this in life? Like gotten a full glimpse? No, it's all right. Sometimes people say astronauts, right? But no, because there are no clouds. The map is color-coded. And also some stuff is missing, right? And what's missing if you were, say you could hover in a spacecraft, which would be kind of fun.
The oceans, Mexico.
Oceans, Mexico, Canada. Yeah, Hawaii and Alaska are not on this map. Why?
They don't matter.
Let's just be, straightforward about it. Yeah. Yeah, they don't fit. They're awkward. Every map maker who makes a map of the United States has to figure out how to deal with Hawaii and Alaska because they're in awkward places. You have a lot of blank space if you include them on the map. But to not include them is odd, just because they don't happen to be handy. And also to not include Canada and Mexico, of course, gives you a strange sense of isolationism. We will not talk politics. But But here, 48 of the states are shown removed from the rest of the world. And again, they're color-coded. The important thing to think about is that this is a very familiar looking map. We all know what it seems to be a map of, but this is an abstraction, right? William Gibson said that the internet is a consensus hallucination. We all believe in it, and it seems to function, and so we accept that it exists, right? We don't know exactly what it is, but it's out there. The World Wide Web, he was describing. Yeah, and in the same way, this is a kind of consensus hallucination. It doesn't actually exist, not quite this way, but we accept it for what it is, and we accept its conventions. If you could see it very closely, and if it were in proper focus, you'd be able to see that the states are shown in outline and things like that. So it shows political boundaries, although not all political boundaries, because it doesn't include Alaska and Hawaii. And it gives us an idea of rainfall for some reason. Those are the things that this map maker cared about and assumed that the audience cared about. And so even in the most conventional looking maps, we're constantly making decisions about what we think is important, what other people think is important. Dennis Wood argues that there is no such thing as an objective map. And on some level, it's true simply because you're making choices all the time about what to include. I will finish with not that. That'd be fun. Yeah, Cloud Atlas. This is a big bean, big metal bean called Cloud Atlas in Millennium Park in Chicago. It's not a map, you noticed. But Anish Kapoor was invited to create a sculpture, a site-specific sculpture for Millennium Park. And the thing most artists would do is, well, in the old days, it would have been a horse or it would have been a couple soldiers or whatever, somebody famous from Chicago, or a piece of abstraction named Hope, But this is an abstraction too, but the fact that it is highly polished like that has made it an incredibly popular feature of the downtown landscape in Chicago. My guess is wherever you put it would be pretty popular. It has kind of a childish or childlike appeal because, of course, it works a little bit like a funhouse mirror. When you walk under it, you get different kinds of distortions. People take pictures in this. There must be thousands of pictures taken of this thing every day. If you go online, you can. They just pile up. But what's interesting to me about this is one of the things that it does is it remaps the skyline, right? Wherever you stand, you see the Chicago skyline a little bit differently. And of course, it changes with weather and other things. Basically, it simply reflects back to people what was already there, but it enchants people. And it's kind of ingenious to think about the sculpture, not as something everybody needs to look at to see something else, but to look at to see themselves in some different way. And it's a beautiful gift to kind of remind us to change our perception. And maybe I'll stop there because I think we're near time when some people need to go. So I'll stop. If you want to talk about these things, that'd be great. If you want to talk about, it's not over here anymore, but if you want to talk about puzzles and magic, that'd be fine. But I'm here. And if you have to leave, this is your chance. Yeah.